Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the World Cup. Most Americans have heard of the World Cup, but few watch it. This small but significant fact is illustrative of the gargantuan difference between the United States and the rest of the world. The World Cup is a month-long spectacular, a sports fest that the majority of the world relishes, and yet there is little coverage of the games in the United States. The best evidence of this synapse between the US, or us, and the rest of the world is the match that was played between the US and Iran. As I perused the coverage on TV and online, all I got was the results of the match. In other words, that the United States won against Iran. It took me 20 minutes of searching to actually find the score. And yes, the United States did win. The score was 1-0. About 1.5 billion people will watch the World Cup. If there are 7 billion people in the world, in rough numbers, that means that about 1 in every 6 people in the world will be watching the World Cup. Consider how many poor and underprivileged people there are in China and India and in Africa. Those people do not have TVs or computers and Wi-Fi to click on. They don't have the luxury of going to the local bar or pub or luxury hotel with a widescreen TV and continuous coverage of the World Cup. That means that nearly the entire world that can get a TV or phone reception is actually watching the World Cup, except for us. We skew the numbers. I've driven through the desert during a World Cup match and seen satellite dishes hooked up to Bedouin tents. I saw and heard their TVs blaring out the game. That is correct. Bedouins who live in tents are watching the World Cup. And we're oblivious. Americans are so far removed from this overwhelming sport phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon that the US citizens don't even know that the World Cup is actually called Mondial. It's not even called the World Cup everywhere else. Everyone else all over the world knows that the United States calls the game that's being played in Qatar right now soccer, while the rest of the world calls it football. We are certainly a stubborn, self-centered lot. Israelis, for example, take the World Cup very seriously. During the month-long competition, men gain significant weight. The sales of snack food increases dramatically. And imagine a month-long Super Bowl. Imagine how much pizza and wings would be consumed. Between 30 and 50,000 Israelis will be attending the games in person. Israel and Qatar do not have diplomatic relations. Officially, they are enemies. But for the sake of the games, and after months of diplomacy and negotiations, the two countries came to an agreement allowing Israelis to visit Qatar to watch the games. They even arranged direct flights between the countries. But no national airline agreed to pick up the gauntlet and arrange the flights. Instead, a small Cypriot airline agreed to fly from Tel Aviv, then touch down a few minutes in Cyprus, then take off from Cyprus and fly to Qatar. Qatar had even agreed with FIFA, the official organizer of the World Cup, the Mondial, to place no restrictions on Israelis and treat them like any other fans from any other country that was coming to watch the games. But at the last minute, Qatar changed the rules. Jewish prayer would not be permitted in public. Hot, kosher food would not be permitted. In this case, Israel is in good company, but it doesn't ease the disappointment. Not only did Qatar's leadership change the rules on Israel, they did it to Budweiser also. At the last minute, they declared that no beer would be served at the games, only non-alcoholic beer. Budweiser is a major sponsor of the games, to the tune of $70 million. And the original agreement was that Bud would be permitted inside, but not outside the stadiums. And only during the game itself, not pre or post. It just so happens that Budweiser sells an alcohol-free beer, and they're going to put that out. But that's beside the point. And they have said that they will forward all the regular beer, the alcoholic beer, to the winning country. Israelis saw the games as an opportunity. Israeli media would be covering the games. All their networks sent media delegations, and then reality struck. Boom. Israelis were shocked by the reception they received. Drivers, when they discovered that their fares were from Israel, stopped short and dropped their passengers in the middle of the road without even collecting their fares. A police officer, while driving the head of the Israeli players' delegation in a golf cart inside the compound, the World Cup compound, discovered that his passengers were from Israel. He became visibly upset. The passengers quickly recanted and said that it was a joke and told the driver they were from Paraguay. No one cares about Paraguay. The driver responded that, had it been true, he would have stopped the cart and asked them to get out. Those of us who do manage to find the World Cup in the good old USA cannot help but notice all the Palestinian flags in the backgrounds of official broadcasts. It's a shame. It's a missed opportunity. Budweiser took an unfortunate occurrence and turned it into a savvy public relations moment. Israel doesn't have that luxury. Israel is still at war with Qatar, but almost no Qataris are working at the games. Few, if any, Israelis are actually meeting Qataris. There are 3 million people who live in Qatar, but there are only 300,000 Qatari citizens. The rest are foreign workers. The spectators who came to the match and to watch the World Cup came from all over the world. Many came from countries that are at war with Israel. Even those who came from countries that signed onto the Abraham Accords are not all in agreement with the Accords. The Abraham Accords are actually agreements between Israel and the leaders of the countries that signed. The benefits have not and will not trickle down to the masses in those Arab countries. FIFA cannot dictate the attitudes soccer fans have, especially their attitude towards Israel. It's unreasonable to even expect that from the World Cup. Israelis had an exaggerated exuberance about the games. More than the excitement of the sport, they thought that because they were permitted to attend the games, they could make headway with their enemies. They thought that everything would be like the Abraham Accords. Instead, Israelis should have thought of the World Cup like they think of the United Nations, the UN. You're allowed to attend. You're a member. But there will be no handshake or pleasantries. Instead, lots of stares, a barrage of insults, and people turning their back and even walking away. They were expecting way too much from the World Cup. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from the JTA. It is by Andrew Silo Carroll, and it was published on November 22nd, 2022. The column is entitled Exhausting, Never-Ending Job of Debunking Anti-Semitic Conspiracy Theories. Subtitled Opinion: While modern anti-Semitism may be less blatant than how it used to be, people today use conspiracy theories and tall tales to make Jews be seen in a negative light, but in a more subtle and cunning manner. Silo Carroll addresses the issue of anti-Semitism head-on. He adds important context to the conversations that have been swirling around observations made by David Chappelle, Jon Stewart, and Stephen Colbert. Context that until now has been missing in the public discourse. Most importantly, he points out that the real impact these conversations about anti-Semitism have on its real victims, the Jews. This is how he begins. A few days after the comedian David Chappelle appeared to justify the never-ending appeal of Jewish conspiracy theories, this sentence appeared in the New York Times. Bankman-Fried is already drawing comparisons to Bernie Madoff. I'll explain. Sam Bankman-Fried is the 30-year-old founder of FTX, a cryptocurrency exchange that vaporized overnight, leaving more than 1 million creditors on the hook. Bernie Madoff is, of course, Bernie Madoff, the financier who defrauded thousands of investors through a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme, and he died in prison. Carroll moves on to introduce his most salient point in this entire column, as he sees it. He writes, Chappelle's now notorious monologue on Saturday Night Live is a case in point. At first pass, it is a characteristically mischievous attempt to both mock the rapper Kanye West for his anti-Semitism and to push the boundaries to explain why a troubled black entertainer might feel aggrieved in an industry with historic overrepresentation of Jews. Jon Stewart certainly heard it that way, telling Stephen Colbert, "Look at it from a black perspective. It's a culture that feels that its wealth has been extracted by different groups. That's the feeling in that community. And if you don't understand where it's coming from, then you can't deal with it." Now, that is a very useful message. But consider the messenger. Chappelle appears to disapprove of West's conspiracy mongering, but never once discusses the harm it might cause to the actual targets of the conspiracy. In conclusion, Silo Carroll asserts, "The fault lies not with those who seek to expose anti-Semitism, but with a society that relies on the victims to explain why they shouldn't be victimized. As many have pointed out, anti-Semitism isn't a Jewish problem. It's a problem for the individuals in society who pin their unhappiness and neuroses on a convenient scapegoat. Ultranationalism and intolerance are the soil in which conspiracy take root. But as long as scapegoating remains popular and deadly, the victims have to keep explaining and explaining the obvious. That, for instance, the fact that Sam Bankman-Fried and Bernie Madoff are Jewish is no more significant than the fact that Henry Ford and Elon Musk are two people who founded car companies are Gentiles. The question is, who is listening?" This is a very important column, and it focuses on the essentials, Jew hatred and Jew haters, and how and why their message is so destructive. Next up is a column by Mark Regev. Now, Mark Regev was actually an advisor to the Prime Minister for almost a decade, to Bibi Netanyahu, and he was the ambassador also. And it's from the Jerusalem Post and was published on December 1st, 2022. Regev explains that the Palestinians hurt themselves by not accepting Israel all the way from 1927 until today. The title of Regev's column is 75 Years Since UN Partition Vote, a Self-Inflicted Palestinian Tragedy. Subtitle, ultimately, had the Palestinian position been more pragmatic and moderate, they could have been celebrating a Diamond Jubilee Independence Day alongside Israel. This is how Regev begins. It's well known that on November 29, 1947, the Palestinian Arabs rejected the UN partition proposal that awarded them an independent sovereign state in the territory of British Mandatory Palestine. Less understood is that they not only harbored a deep ideological hostility to the concept of partition, but also opposed all other possible alternative compromises with the Jews. For Zionists, the partition plan was undoubtedly flawed. The UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, divided the homeland, allotted the Jews territory separated into 3 areas, 2 of them very small and the third largely desert, and internationalized Jerusalem, leaving the ancient capital outside the borders of the proposed Jewish state. Nonetheless, the Jews celebrated the General Assembly's support for the partition. For them, UNSCOP's plan, multiple drawbacks were mitigated by the overriding factor. The organized international community had endorsed the principle of Jewish statehood. Everything else was secondary. Regev paints pictures for us. He draws us back into a time and helps us understand what people felt as history was unfolding. He continues, popular enthusiasm for the resolution can be seen in black and white footage shot contemporaneously. The Jews of Mandatory Palestine glued to their radios, listening to the live broadcasts from Lake Success, where the UN was meeting, marking down each UN member's vote in the yes or no or abstain columns. And when 2/3 of the majority was achieved, erupting in the spontaneous jubilation, literally dancing in the streets. The grassroots rejoicing echoed the position of the Zionist leadership, headed by Chaim Weizmann, later the first president of the State of Israel, and David Ben-Gurion, its first prime minister. Neither was enamored with the borders set out by the UNSCOP plan, but they had taken a strategic decision. A small state was preferable to no state at all. Regev offers example after example of how the Palestinians simply made the wrong decision and refused to accept Israel. He concludes by writing, "This upcoming May, the Palestinians will not be joining the Israelis in celebrating the 75th existence of the Jewish state. Instead, they will mourn their Nakba, catastrophe. But perhaps they should recall at a historic inflection point as the Union Jack was lowered and the colonial powers departed, when the opportunity for sovereignty was within reach, which side embraced partition and which side rejected it. It's easy for the Palestinians to blame their statelessness and dispossession on the Zionists. This ubiquitous, knee-jerk response avoids confronting difficult questions about their own leadership's all-or-nothing culpability in their national tragedy, while being emblematic of an enduring, self-defeating, maximalist nationalism. Ultimately, had the Palestinian position been more pragmatic, more moderate, they too could have been celebrating a Diamond Jubilee Independence Day alongside Israel. Regev is 100% correct. The Palestinians must assume responsibility for the historical situation in which they must now live. It's very, very important. Thank you, Mark Regev. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 6 cartoons and memes today. The first up is a perfect description of Yoda, the beloved Star Wars character, with his unique diction and style of speech. The caption reads, "A car this is not, clever this is." And indeed it is. This next meme is just wonderful. It gives us the Scottish word for the week. The word is dumbfungled, which means to be mentally and physically worn out. I must say I am often dumbfungled these days. This next meme shows us the total hypocrisy of a conference that took place in Egypt on energy conservation. We see an air traffic controller's map of the world's leaders arriving for the conference in Egypt. The caption reads, 800 private jets went to Egypt to tell you to ride your bike to work. By now, just about everyone has heard about how Qatar banned all non-halal meat and all alcohol during the World Cup. This meme explains it and what it means to be at the games without your favorite meats and beverages this way. A hot dog and a pint at the World Cup. What do we see? An empty bun and an empty beer glass. Next up is a set of pictures that compares a photo of Bernie Madoff with a photo of Sam Bankman-Fried. Andrew Seiler's column alongside this, by the way, is very important. It's frightening. But young Bernie Madoff looks a lot like SBM. Really weird. This is eerie. Finally, we have a sign that reads, "Please do not eat in the library." And now the explanation of the sign. It reads, "The ants will get in and learn to read and get too smart, and knowledge is power, and power corrupts, so they'll turn evil and take over the world." In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Bibi Netanyahu was a guest on NBC's Sunday morning show, Meet the Press. He discussed his political aspirations, as well as where he draws the line when it comes to rising anti-Semitism from political allies.
I'm going to safeguard Israeli democracy. I'm going to bring peace categorically. I think I can get another breakthrough for peace, and I'm going to stop Iran. That's what I'm coming back for, and that's what I'm committed to.
During the interview, Bibi was asked about former U.S. President Donald Trump's recent meeting with anti-Semites, Kanye West and Nick Fuentes.
On this matter, on Kanye West and that other unacceptable guest, I think it's not merely unacceptable, it's just wrong. And I hope he sees his way to staying out of it and condemning it.
Bibi is setting the framework for his government and drawing essential red lines. The former and future Prime Minister of Israel is not afraid of upsetting Donald Trump. Iranian authorities executed 4 people. They claim that the 4 were spies for Israel. IRNA, Iran's state-run media outlet, reported that 4 men were accused of working for Israel's Mossad intelligence agency. 3 other men received lengthy prison sentences. According to IRNA, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard announced the arrests of the network of people linked to the Israeli agency. It said that the members of this network had previous criminal records and had tried to disrupt the country's security. IRNA reported that the network members stole and destroyed private and public property and kidnapped individuals and interrogated them. The alleged spies have weapons and received wages from Mossad in the form of cryptocurrency. In the report, there was no mention of a trial or a conviction, just catching and executing 4 Iranian men and prison sentences for the other 3. Kanye West announced for one and all to hear that he liked and admired Hitler. Kanye West, now known as Ye, made this statement while in conversation with right-wing radio host Alex Jones. The disgraced rapper, who has made a series of anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish statements in the past month, said, and I'm quoting here, "I see good things about Hitler also." And then he went on to say that Jews cannot tell him who to like.
That's right. You're not Hitler. You're not a Nazi. You don't deserve to be called that and demonized.
Well, I see good things about Hitler also. The Jew, I love everyone. I'm done with the classifications. Every human being has something of value that they brought to the table, especially Hitler.
I could not believe my ears when I heard the tape, especially when Kanye said he was not doing it for effect and that he really thinks that Hitler was good. It was shocking to me. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz said that Iran has the ability to put together a nuclear bomb within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, he said, speaking to the military attachés of 30 countries. The outgoing Israeli defense minister said that in recent years, Tehran has carried out 16 attacks against civilian targets in the Red Sea and the Gulf. Gantz also told the group of military attachés that Israel was advancing plans to supply Ukraine with early warning systems in their fight against Russian invasion, to be used especially against missile attacks. Israel is very concerned about both Iran and Russia. Israel is working to contain the aggression of these hostile countries. U.S. military stopped their patrols against the Islamic State in Syria. U.S. forces have stopped joint military patrols in northern Syria, patrols intended to counter Islamic State extremists. Why? Because Turkish threats of ground invasion have stymied the U.S. missions, which are held together with Kurdish forces, because the Turks might fire on the Kurds when the United States is with them. However, other more limited security patrols by the U.S. and Kurdish troops, particularly around prisons, will continue. Meanwhile, U.S. Central Command announced that American troops have paused all their joint operations with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces against the Islamic State in Syria. Interestingly, the Pentagon in D.C. said that joint operations were ongoing but reduced. 3 different announcements, 3 different policies, a lot of confusion. Iranian state media announced that they have begun construction on a brand new nuclear plant. Iran TV announced that the new nuclear plant is located in the country's southwest. The announcement came amid tensions with the United States, which has slapped Iran with heavy sanctions, specifically because of their nuclear development. The United States imposed these sweeping sanctions after Washington pulled out of the Islamic Republic's nuclear deal that was being brokered with world powers. The Iranian announcement was released just as Iran has rocked the nationwide anti-government protests that began after the death of a young woman in police custody. Protests have challenged the country's theocratic government. According to the report, this new 300-megawatt plant, known as Karun, will take 8 years to build and will cost around $2 billion. The plant will be located, as I said, in Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province, near its southwestern border with Iraq. The United States intercepted a fishing boat that was smuggling ammunition in the Gulf of Oman. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet announced that it had intercepted a fishing trawler smuggling more than 50 tons of ammunition rounds, fuses, propellants for rockets. In the Gulf of Oman, along the maritime route from Iran to Yemen. The statement read, Navy personnel operating from Expeditionary Sea Base USS Lewis P. Puller, the ESB-3, discovered the illicit cargo during a flag verification boarding, marking U.S. Fifth Fleet's second major illegal weapons seizure within a month. This is very important. Stopping the flow of weapons is essential to maintaining stability and safety in the Gulf and everywhere else in the region. Iran's Attorney General has announced that he is reviewing the Iranian government's hijab law. Iran's parliament and judiciary are reviewing a law which requires women to cover their heads, a law which was triggered months of deadly protests in Iran. The hijab, or headscarf, became obligatory for all women in Iran in April 1983, 4 years after the 1979 revolution that overthrew the US-backed monarchy there. Both Parliament and the judiciary are working on the issue of whether the law needs any changes, according to spokesperson Mohammad Jafar Matazeri. Iran is feeling the pressure. If the hijab was so important, why did it take 4 years from 79 to 83 to put the law in place? OPEC Plus agreed to stick to its oil output. Two OPEC sources told Reuters that as the oil markets struggle to assess the impact of a slowing Chinese economy on demand, and as the G7 price cap for $60 a barrel is put on Russian oil, they will not change their current output on supply. This decision of OPEC Plus came 2 days after the group of G7 nations agreed on the price cap on Russian oil. Russia is a very large supplier of oil, and the West is trying to pressure Russia by limiting their profits per barrel of oil. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that I mentioned the Kurds a lot? We should learn a little bit about them since I'm talking about them so much. The Kurdish population numbers are about 35 to 45 million people. They live almost exclusively in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Only about 1.5 million Kurds live outside that area, 750,000 of them in Germany. Kurds are Muslims. Their language that they speak is Kurdish. It has several different dialects, but very similar to Persian. After World War I, when many new states were created, Kurds were promised that they would receive a state as part of the treaties of Sèvres in 1920. But in 1923, when the boundaries of the new states were designated in the Treaty of Lausanne, there was only Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, no Kurdistan. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.